Hello everyone, my name is Tom Buitelaar and I am a fourth year PhD student at the European University Institute. I have the distinct pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Leiden University's Chair on UN Studies in Peace and Justice. This chair aims to increase the visibility and relevance of the UN to the general public and is currently held by Professor Alanna Mali. So while many of us will be dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic by working from home and limiting our social contacts, its effects are also being felt to a much larger degree by UN peacekeepers. Not only are they often on the front lines in efforts to limit its spread, but they'll probably have to deal with other structural consequences of the pandemic for a long time to come. To better understand the short and long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on UN peacekeeping, we organized this webinar. And we are very happy to have such a great set of panelists who will reflect on this topic from varying perspectives, moderated by the excellent Alexandra Novoselov. Towards the second half of this event, there will also be room for a Q&A with the audience. So if you have any questions to one or more of the panelists, please post them in the chat box of YouTube and we'll try to include them in the hour or so that we have for this webinar. So that only leaves me to thank the moderator and the panelists for their kind willingness to participate, and thank you as the audience for watching this webinar. I'll leave the floor to Alexandra and hope you enjoy it.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you all are. Thank you very much for to the University of Leiden and to the chair on UN Studies in Peace and Justice to organize this webinar. I'm Alexandra Novoselov. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the International Peace Institute in New York, currently based in Paris, where I'm also a research associate at the University of Paris Panthéon-Assas. Those of you who have registered may have seen the questions that will guide our debate today, trying to see what could be the impact of coronavirus on the future of UN peacekeeping, in particular in terms of political attention given to those operations, in terms of management within the secretariats, in terms of the nature of conflicts, in financial terms, of course, and also in the way the Secretary General's initiative called A4P, Action for Peacekeeping, will remain or not at the center of UN's efforts to reform and gain support from member states. To look at all these issues, we have a great and diverse panel of experts. First, Mr. Jeremy Drage, coordinator, chief of the Joint Operations Center, JOC at MONUSCO, currently in Kinshasa. He has been chief JOC since February 2015 and had previously 32 years of career in the British Army. Second, we'll have Slađana Semericic Pantelic, I hope I pronounce your name right, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, where she is a policy coordinator at the Security and Policy Department, responsible for UN peacekeeping. Third, we'll have Adam Day, who is the head of programs at the UN University Center for Policy Research in New York, based in New York, a center that he joined in January 2017 after many years in the field. And last but not least, we'll have Richard Gowan, who is the UN Director at the International Crisis Group, where he leads the advocacy work of this NGO at the UN, and he has been working previously at Columbia University, at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and at CIC, the Center in International Cooperation of New York University. So each of our panelists will have 5 minutes before I give the floor, of course, to the audience for a series of questions. And we will start with a view from the field. So Jeremy, you have the floor. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Alexandra, and thank you all very much for inviting me to this webinar. I'm very happy to be representing my SRSG, Madam Leila Zarougi, here today. I'd first like to say and underline that in the context of the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC as I'll call it, the government has made it clear throughout that it wants to count on the support of the UN and MONUSCO in these difficult times, particularly with regards to protection of civilians, which is a key strategic priority of the mission here. I should say, as some of you will clearly understand, that I'm speaking from the perspective of a field mission and not from our headquarters in New York. But we work very closely together, headquarters and mission, on strategic planning and on operational delivery. From the outset of this crisis, it was clear to us that we would take a stance of stay and deliver, remaining operational whilst yet ensuring our own staff's safety and avoiding the UN becoming a vector of transmission of COVID. While our mandate's not changed because of this, the pandemic has had a large impact on the political and security context in which we're operating. Political actors, particularly here in Kinshasa, have shifted their focus to mitigating the potentially devastating medical and socio-economic effects of the pandemic. In the east of the country, where we're most represented, they are currently less affected by COVID, and most mission-critical tasks, particularly in the realms of protection of civilians, are still going on. And we're combining our operations with COVID sensitization where possible. The wider humanitarian development projects, such as inoculation programs, are being affected by the disease. And it's worth reflecting that currently many more people are dying in DRC from measles and cholera than from COVID. The mission stepped up its support to COVID-related initiatives, including a few examples. We've partnered with the Ministry of Education and UNICEF to use UN Radio as a tool for distance learning for millions of students from home. We've been providing support to the authorities in limiting the spread of COVID in prisons, and we've been involved in technical support to contact tracing. The identification of and guidance on essential tasks has been driven primarily by our ability to sustain our engagement with relevant counterparts and balance mandate delivery with staff safety. Our staff have proven to be very professional and committed in ensuring continuation of operations under these circumstances. Adapting the mission to this new reality, politically, operationally, and administratively too, has been a challenge. Politically, the focus on mitigating the pandemic and the risk of transmission has complicated our meetings with interlocutors, which has been an essential aspect of progress on the longer-term non-COVID matters. Specifically, as some of you will know, this is impacting on our Security Council mandated discussions with the government here on the transition from a peacekeeping mission, as well as on the implementation of a nexus approach to development post-conflict. Operationally, supporting the government's efforts to combat COVID and continuing to deliver operationally, especially on protection, whilst adhering to preventive measures is a key tenet for MONUSCO. Nevertheless, severe travel restrictions, lockdowns and quarantine, which I know you're all facing in your own countries, are a challenge for the mission here, which relies very heavily on its own mobility to be able to be effective in a country the size of Western Europe. Administratively, we've had to take measures to ensure appropriate COVID protection for our personnel medically and handle the delays in rotation of our military and police units and the movements of our civilian staff in and out of the mission, as well as around the mission. It's tricky to assess the pandemic's duration here in the DRC, as you will know from your own countries, and its impact on the country, therefore, and on the mission. However, we can see some trends and possible effects emerging. Now, maybe more than ever, I say that peacekeeping operations have to deliver on their mandates, and we'll hear from our colleagues on this more. We believe strongly in peace operations and the wider by host nations and the international community on our ability to continue to deliver to those in need and to live up to the expectations of those we serve. Thus, despite being designed to be adaptable, as we are in the field missions in complex situations, even a temporary failure, I think, of those that we're mandated to protect will have a damaging impact on the legitimacy and relevance of peacekeeping going forwards. So in the short term, our engagement will be directed towards maintaining protection of civilian operations and supporting the government in its efforts to mitigate the effects of the virus. Whereas in the medium term, we have to fulfill our mandate and produce a roadmap to an end state in, say, 3 years, in partnership with the government and to the satisfaction of UN members. Finally, summing up, it is as yet unclear how the domestic effects of the pandemic may influence UN member states themselves and their donors, and thus affect budgetary decisions for peacekeeping in the years to come. And back to you, Alexandra.
Many thanks, Jeremy. Now I'll give the floor to Slaviana. Can you open your mic, please?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm just, I want to say that I'm very much honored to be a member of this panel with such distinguished fellow panelists. I'm speaking on the behalf of the Netherlands, of our government, and I'm sharing our views on the effects of the pandemic on peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping. The pandemics will definitely change peacekeeping for better or worse. That will we see in due time. However, coming from a country of pragmatic optimists, I do believe that we, meaning the United Nations, its member states, regional organizations, academic world, non-governmental organizations, humanitarian associations, have a chance to make the peacekeeping simpler and more effective. Never waste a good crisis, someone said, and it's a rather appropriate sentence in this situation. I think that the United Nations and the Secretary General in particular understood that very well and communicated clearly the 5 tracks of the fight against this unprecedented pandemic. The call for global ceasefire made by the Secretary General Guterres is an example of true leadership in these challenging times. What does this crisis mean for the UN peacekeeping? Should the peacekeeping operations shift their attention to humanitarian assistance or disaster response? As I said, I come from a country of pragmatic optimists, but also a country of realists. This may be the deepest worldwide crisis since the end of the Second World War, and the common enemy has full attention all over the world, but we are all aware that the need for the UN peacekeeping operations will be there also in the future. There are other actors involved in managing the non-traditional security threats, humanitarian assistance and disaster response, such as OCHA, UN OCHA, and the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, which is very close to my heart. The close cooperation with these actors in the current crisis is necessary, and it will be even more necessary in future possible crises. However, the core task of the peacekeeping operations should be peacekeeping. The unpredictability of the current crisis for the future is immense. There are a lot of things which we don't know that might happen, but we do know is that many and perhaps all UN member states will experience an economic crisis anytime soon. This means that most of these states will be unable, reluctant, or unwilling to contribute to public goods such as peacekeeping and to fight climate change, for example. A public good like peacekeeping requires collective action to bring about, and it is therefore extra vulnerable during a crisis for free riding, which in practice means that United Nations member states will look to each other to contribute to the troops and equipment to UN peacekeeping. In other words, due to the increasing instability in the world, the demand for the peacekeeping will increase, while due to COVID-19, the supply or ability to contribute to peacekeeping operations will decrease. So the problem that we will face is how we, meaning the United Nations, will cope with the scarcity of resources in the near future, knowing that people and countries rely on us. So I believe that part of the solution is strengthening the narrative surrounding the UN peacekeeping and to stress that multilateralism is more important than ever. In our view, we should and could use the framework of Action for Peacekeeping initiative to push forward some changes in the peacekeeping. As I said, the pandemic will make all the resources, personnel, financial, and critical enablers more scarce. It would be a good idea to put the declaration of shared commitments against the background of current situation and to make adaptations in the priorities and steps to be taken. Safety and security of the peacekeeping personnel will most likely get a new dimension. The same goes for protection of civilians. The strict measures to prevent contamination by the peacekeepers themselves in the host countries means also less contact with the local population. Finally, the performance of the operations will come under further pressure. We are in favor of innovative and creative solutions to make missions more fit for purpose and capable of implementing their mandates. Together with Ireland, the Netherlands is looking into the possibilities to establish rotation mechanisms for national contributions of, in particular, key enablers and high-end capabilities and enablers into and out of the peacekeeping missions for limited periods. We also plea for more focused peacekeeping operation mandates. Last but not least, we believe that introduction of integrated planning in both preparation as realization phase will contribute to the smoother and better implementation of the mission mandates. My final words for this introduction is COVID-19 brings a lot of challenges, but also some new openings. We should explore these openings and adapt not the idea, but the concept of peacekeeping. I will finish with the famous words of the Dutch legendary football player, late Johan Cruyff. Every disadvantage has its advantage. Bear in mind these wise words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sladiana. Now we turn to Adam.
Thanks, Alexandra, and thanks to Leiden University. And it's really nice to see missions like MONUSCO in such good hands as Jeremy. Nice to see old friends too. There's a running debate within the UN Department of Peace Operations as to whether COVID is going to be a good or a bad thing for peacekeeping. Will it depress budgets and leave less cash for missions? Will it generate new conflicts and increase the demand for interventions? Will the enormous outpouring of money on the COVID response make peacekeeping feel like a drop in the bucket? Or will it just make major powers less focused on international peace and security issues? I think my main point is that really, regardless of whether COVID is good or bad for peacekeeping, it's probably bad for peace. Our research at UN University has shown that, that economic shocks strongly tend to precede violent conflict. Examples like Yemen and Syria come to mind, but shocks can also be transformational. Tunisia during the Arab Spring or Sudan last year are examples there. What's clear is that COVID-19 will cause deep and long-term economic downturns around the world. It's less clear what impact those will have on conflict-prone countries, especially the ones that we're all watching and have been for some time. Places like Cameroon and Burkina Faso and Venezuela, but also maybe places like Ethiopia that could well be negatively affected by a really serious downturn. I've argued in some recent publications that the demand for peace operations might well go up as some of these countries might be pushed closer to conflict. That doesn't necessarily mean there'll be more peace operations. And I'm guessing Richard will speak a bit more about the Security Council dynamics that may shape that question. But a potential increase in demand for peace operations is only really the first part of a much more interesting question, which is what kind of UN intervention might be needed to meet today's and tomorrow's conflicts. Here, I think COVID is just one of several factors and trends that should be taken into account. And here are just a few relevant facts from some of our recent research. First is that civil wars have been on the rise for the past 10 years, at least. We've documented a significant growth in the number and severity of internal conflicts. Second, these conflicts have proven more intractable. They're tougher to resolve, they're more prone to relapse, and much more dangerous to civilians than in many earlier eras. Third is that this is in part due to the impact of transnational criminal networks, the growing effect of violent extremist groups, and the willingness of regional players to meddle in internal wars. Those factors combine. And fourth, the role of social uprisings, not just the Arab Spring, but more generally, has pointed to the deep social, political, and economic factors in today's wars. Inequality and marginalization are increasingly recognized as drivers of conflict, and COVID is almost certain to deepen some of those inequalities. So whatever kind of UN interventions there might be in the future, they will need to take these trends into account along with COVID. Large multidimensional peacekeeping missions costing in the realm of $1 billion a year might not be the ideal tools for addressing many of these dynamics, though there might well be times when the partial security guarantee offered by peacekeeping troops could be the right fit. Jeremy's spoken about some of the protection focus of MONUSCO, for example. Based on these trends, though, I'll offer 4 quick recommendations for shaping future peace operations. And I think Slađana's point about Action for Peacekeeping being maybe a conduit for some of this is probably right. The first one is to think of peace operations along a spectrum, where on one side you've got a 1-person special envoy, and at the other end you've got a 20,000 troop multidimensional operation. One of the perverse outcomes of the peace and security reform that's happened over the last few years is that exactly the opposite has happened. The Department of Peace Operations now deals exclusively with peacekeeping. And it's exactly the opposite of the idea that the high-level independent panel on peace operations suggested, which is to think along a spectrum. Thinking along a spectrum rather than in a binary way about, is this a peacekeeping operation or not, I think is a good starting point to get out of cookie cutter models for deploying operations. Not that they all are. The second is to think flexibly about use of force and ask tough questions about what situations really benefit from the kind of security guarantee or not that troops provide. There are other models that could be employed. For example, you could have missions composed almost entirely of armed foreign police units for increasingly urban insecurity. There could be missions that are largely unarmed individual police officers. Haiti offers some early ideas of what some of those models might look like. One point is at least increasingly clear to me, which is that in settings of asymmetric warfare involving violent extremist groups, traditional UN peacekeeping models appear to be a poor fit and quite a dangerous one for UN forces on the ground. And Mali is the most dangerous mission today. The third is to get a grip of the political economy of conflict. The roles of transnational illicit networks, corruption, social exclusion, all of these together point to the need for UN interventions to be more grounded in the political economy of situations. And not just about analysis, but about interventions too. And there are examples in Yemen where the UN worked with banks more directly around some of its work. In MONUSCO, when I was there, the mission set up a criminal networks task force that looked at really how armed groups and criminal networks work together, including with other actors, and designed interventions around that. I think especially in the COVID-19 era, more attention will have to be paid to how economies and shocks are felt unequally across programming by the UN and by others. It was interesting to hear Slađana call peacekeeping a public good. It seems like she's taking a political economy approach as well. The fourth and final recommendation is around cross-border programming. The UN tends to be really bound by national borders just because of the way it's set up. Regional strategies have become a real mantra for the UN. It now has regional strategies for the Sahel, for the Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes, the Western Balkans, but these have tended to stay at a fairly general level. Issues like transhumance in the Sahel, enormous population movements, and trafficking all call for cross-border programming. The mission in Mali has gradually developed some better connectivity with regional players. And I think there's some emerging practice in the peace building area where they've built some programs across borders, especially in the Sahel. I think this more regional approach might need to be more at the center of future peace operations too. So to wrap up, I think COVID-19 is the kind of catastrophe that will provoke us all to rethink how we do nearly everything. And that can be a good thing. And when it comes to peacekeeping, I hope we treat it as an opportunity to question some of our assumptions about what works, about what's needed, and how we can reshape future and present missions for a new era. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you, Adam. Now, Richard, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you to the organizers of the seminar. It's very nice for me to reconnect with UNU, having been a colleague of Adam's at UNU in New York until early last year. I'm really going to pick up on points the other speakers have made. And the first thing I would say, linking to some of Jeremy's comments, is that I think that actually, despite a lot of problems, despite a lot of limitations on what current Blue Helmet operations can do, I think UN peacekeeping has adapted rather well to this crisis. And I think it's worth recalling that 10 years ago, we had a UN operation in Haiti that was responsible for the spread of cholera in that country. And I actually think that since that disaster and through a process of learning, UN DPKO, and then DPO, seems to have found quite a robust and constructive response to a public health crisis of this type. And Jeremy mentioned some of what his colleagues are doing in MONUSCO. I think if you look at the Central African Republic, the mission there has been playing a very important role in supporting a very weak government's response to the disease. There have been other cases where the UN has faced greater limitations. In South Sudan and Mali, I think the impact of the disease on peacekeeping personnel has been damaging. But still, you can find cases in almost every country that we've looked at where UN peacekeepers are stepping up to support public health responses. And that's to the credit of the organization, especially, as I say, 10 years after the Haiti mess. But my three other points are a bit more forward-looking. Firstly, what will this mean for the budget of UN peacekeeping, which is something that all three other speakers referred to? I think here we should look back to 2008 and the fallout from the financial crisis, which was another major global shock that at the time seemed to threaten the financial viability of UN peace operations. What we actually saw in 2008 through to about 2011 was the Fifth Committee, the budgetary committee of the UN, didn't impose slashing cuts on blue helmet operations. There was an understanding that doing so would be irresponsible and could lead to further crises. But the Security Council suddenly became very, very wary of launching any new large-scale UN operations. And in fact, since 2008, the Council has only approved 2 big blue helmet missions. If you leave aside the transition in South Sudan, they were the missions in Mali and the Central African Republic. And in both those cases, budgetary concerns actually did affect the negotiation of the mandates, especially from the perspective of the US. So, the peacekeeping budget is now just over 6 billion, as opposed to 9 billion a decade ago. I don't think that we're going to see slashing cuts to operations like Jeremy's, but I think that the Council will be very, very nervous of new large missions. And I think the Council will also take processes like the drawdown of MONUSCO pretty seriously. I think there'll be less willingness to keep on extending operations that are already in a drawdown phase. Secondly, to pick up on Adam's point that this might lead to more creativity, here I am optimistic. And I think one of the interesting outcomes of the 2008 crisis was that actually in the post-2008 period of austerity, voices in the UN that favored innovative approaches, lighter weight approaches like deploying political missions instead of large peacekeeping operations, got more traction. And actually over the last decade, we've seen a shift towards the UN deploying more lightweight operations and more specialized operations, including quite unique cases like the chemical weapons dismantling operation in Syria. And my sense is that the tendency after COVID is going to be in the same direction. There's going to be less room for big operations, but more room for smaller civilian-based types of peace operation, and perhaps more lightweight operations like the one we currently see in Yemen, trying to monitor the peace agreement in the port of Hodeidah. The last point I'd make, though, is that while I think the UN has responded well to COVID at an operational level, or at least as well as can be expected, the disease has quite seriously infected one part of the organization, and that is the Security Council. And here I think we face a really very serious question about the future of not only UN peacekeeping, but the UN's role in peace and security as a whole, which is that COVID has accelerated the already clear frictions between the permanent members of the Security Council. And one of the previous speakers referred to the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire. That was an act of leadership. But it's also worth saying that the Security Council has taken now more than 3 months to pass any resolution supporting the global ceasefire. They may actually do so this week, but it's been very badly held up by tensions between China and the US. And I think the tensions between China and the US that we've seen around the WHO and COVID more generally are likely to accelerate in the coming years. COVID has sped up a process of worsening great power relations in the Security Council. I think one big question, in some ways even more fundamental than the budgetary one, is how the Council will approach peace operations in an era of acute big power tensions, which may be looming. For the time being, we're still in the happy situation that the Council members can compartmentalize, keep apart their differences over issues like COVID or Syria with how they deal with peacekeeping. And we've actually seen the Council continue to pass resolutions in recent weeks on countries including Sudan and South Sudan, despite their higher level tensions. But I think one concern that must lie ahead is that what COVID has shown us is that the Council is going to become more dysfunctional, and that almost by definition, that will have a long-term effect on the performance of UN peace operations of any size. And this is something to be nervous about going forward.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thanks to all four of you. I think before going to the various questions that we have received, let me maybe summarize a bit of what you just said. I think that it is very early to draw like definite conclusions, but definitely there are trends arising, and as Adam said, a crisis can be good, and I think it gives, it will, you know, give more opportunities, and I think the UN peacekeeping has to take those opportunities. And what we can say also with, as Richard has said, is that definitely the UN peacekeeping has avoided the scenario a la Haiti, and I think that is a very positive effect so far. What Sladiana, for example, has highlighted is also the importance, the growing importance of partnership. This is already the case, but I think that this crisis has increased that importance. On the question of funding, of course, it will drive the UN to be more nimble, as the Secretary General has said many times, and more innovative, and that is also a good thing. Like what Sladiana was mentioning, like you know, some member states engaging in rotational systems. Which was done already, but maybe these things could be increased. I think one of the challenges will be, as Jeremy was saying, you know, because the pandemic is not over, and the UN peacekeeping are still facing with the pandemic in many countries. So how do you become, you know, closer to the people? How do you have a people-centered approach when you actually have to have less contact with the people on the ground? I think Adam mentioned the spectrum, and I quite like this. This is one of my also things I think we should promote. But then it leaves us with the challenge of how to break the various silos that are in the within the UN, and also a question on you know, the reform of the Secretary General in particular. the reform of the resident coordinators, how this will have an impact on peacekeeping. As Jeremy said, you know, I mean, as explained in MONUSCO, that the pandemic drives the peacekeeping operation to look for more partnership also within the UN system. So how you know, will be this will have an impact on the reform of resident coordinators. And I do think also that the UN will be better off if it promotes the whole range of tools that it has in this, you know, in this spectrum of operations. But then on the other hand, as you know, Adam, you were mentioning about looking at the political economy of conflicts, and that peacekeeping should look at that. But then how, you know, how you do this when you're more nimble and when you're more focused on specific mandate, because you know, if funding is lacking, most probably the UN will have to have more focused mandates. With this, I would like to turn to some of the questions that we've received from our our audience. There is a question on US-China tensions and the impact over peacekeeping, but this, I think, has been dealt with by Richard. There is also one question on to what extent would lighter footprints be an option, and that also is derives from what I just said. And to what extent in this option the UN could introduce more technology in order to be more effective. Maybe I can ask Jeremy to answer that question, and then we'll have other questions.
Yeah, thanks, Alexandra. Thanks for the question. I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? And we've talked about it already here. You know, we're still going into the crisis here, really, rather than coming out. But we are reflecting on the fact that we've got very different working arrangements, particularly from a headquarters setting here in Kinshasa. I think if you see things in the field, it's different. Yes, okay, we're trying to still work and take the COVID measures into account. But I mean, the reality is that you have to interface with the people in need, and you have to deal with the bad guys. And you know, you can't do that from your office, or even more so from your flat or house. So you know, the peacekeeping still requires that interface with the people where you are, and so that aspect of it, I think, is hard to sort of relocate somewhere else. But I think if you see it from a headquarters point of view, and I mean, I'm not in HQ, but I mean, they've been operating largely outside of their building for a while, as we have been doing it here in Kinshasa. And I think it would be it's an opportunity to consider this from a UN perspective and from a mission perspective as to whether we can operate differently but better. You know, we should be doing things, learning from this and learning good things. We do it better, then let's do it. If it saves money as well, that's good, isn't it? You know, we shouldn't do things more expensively. You know, we're all under budgetary pressure. So I would recommend that it's an opportunity. It may or may not offer much, but we should certainly consider it. As far as technology goes, well, yeah, absolutely. I think we should be embracing technology. Sometimes big technological changes are hard for big organizations to introduce because they're very big and expensive and cumbersome. And so the temptation is to do things very small, incrementally, and so on, and perhaps get behind on the technical curve. So maybe you know, the shock of something like COVID is a way to look at it in a bigger picture and say, can we do things differently on logistics, for example? But generally speaking, you know, I think it's, without saying yes, we could to any of this, I think yes, there is clearly an opportunity to review it, and you know, and doing a you know, quick and dirty first study into it as to how we can be more cost and effective as a result of these changes would be very worthwhile, and then that can be evolved from there. Over.
It's true. We tend to forget that technology is expensive, and the UN will have to strike a balance between, you know, using technology or trying to find some other means, more political means, maybe. Let me now turn to a question that is specifically directed at Adam. How can COVID-19 potentially be good for peacekeepers, but not for peace, when the goal of peacekeeping is to navigate from conflict to peace? And that's a question from Ella from the UN Youth Impact.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the question, Ella. I think what I meant in terms of good for peacekeeping is the question about whether peacekeeping will get the attention and the support it requires, whether it will grow as a practice or shrink. There could be an increase in conflicts, but not an increase in peacekeeping. And I think the question that Richard was getting to a bit is whether divisions in the council might spill over into peacekeeping. But I think it's also a point about what types of conflict dynamics might emerge. Will it be great power tensions exacerbated by the COVID response? That would be very unlikely to get a response from a divided council. But if it's more civil war types of conflicts, then the council has actually shown a real willingness to act, even when it's been pretty divided on other issues. And Richard's written a great piece called Minimum Order, where he highlights some of the areas where the council has managed to stay united and take action. I just wanted to pick up on the other point, Alexandra, you made about contact with communities, which I think is really important. There's a real drive within the UN for better local knowledge, for more contact with communities, for early warning based on human intelligence. In South Sudan right now, people have to stay home. How is early warning going to work in that setting? And one of the comments pointed to maybe more technology. In Eastern Congo, there's a pretty vibrant WhatsApp group of a lot of local Congolese that feed the early warning system. Those can be really good, but I think it's just really difficult to replace human intelligence. And if our interface with humans goes down as a result of this, which it already is, I think it's going to be a challenge there to really replace it. And I just wanted to flag that Cedric de Koning has done a very good piece for NUPI that shows how peacekeeping is already being hit at an operational level in many ways, including with real impacts on national staff and their ability to continue to participate and gain from peacekeeping. So I'll leave it there. I think that there are some other questions, but I think others could probably take those.
Yeah, it's true. You know, with less people in missions, then you know, how do you keep effectiveness? There is a question on the factor impacting the long-term future of peacekeeping. How important will it actually be? And wouldn't, for example, a potential second Trump administration may have a larger impact on peacekeeping and on the funding in general, I guess, of the UN? Maybe Richard, can you answer this question?
I mean, I think so the overall question, which is, will other factors be more important than COVID? I think it is really worth saying, and a number of us have already touched on this, is that we're still at a very early stage of the COVID crisis. And in terms of economics, especially in terms of the recession that comes out of this crisis, you know, if we're going into a 4 or 5 year major global economic downturn, then the economic pressure will be absolutely huge. And even if the disease is eventually brought under control, you know, the economic effect of that, not only on peace operations, but also on other UN entities, is going to be enormous. And I would actually worry more, for example, for the budgets of development agencies and perhaps even humanitarian agencies than peacekeeping. We've seen, for example, that the UN has only received about a quarter of what it's asked for in terms of the humanitarian response to COVID this year. And those sort of financial limitations could get worse and worse. So you can't really detach COVID from a lot of the other factors that would affect UN conflict management and conflict response. Specifically as to Trump, you know, there may be a silver lining here, because it does seem that COVID has decreased the chances of a second Trump administration. Since the disease kicked in, we have seen Biden improving in the polls. And in a scenario where you have a President Biden, then I think you'll actually find the US would invest very heavily in multilateral engagement. That's something that's coming through a lot of democratic statements at the moment. And that would include relaunching the sort of close cooperation with the UN Secretariat on peacekeeping that we saw in the later Obama years. Obama invested very heavily in trying to boost UN peacekeeping in 2014, 2015. I think that would continue under a Biden administration. So maybe COVID gives us Biden, and Biden restores the virility of UN peacekeeping. Maybe it doesn't. And maybe we do get a Trump second term. And I think in a Trump second term, then yes, a lot of the economic but also great power factors we've been talking about would kick in even harder than they have before. And I think that overall, that would be a very tough political environment for the UN to navigate through.
Thank you, Richard. Now let me turn to two questions that I will direct to Slaviana. There was a question on the impact of the funding, obviously, on some of the ongoing reforms, like in terms of WPS, Women, Peace and Security Agenda, in terms of increasing the number of female peacekeepers. So I guess in the broad framework of A4P, and also another question on to what extent do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic will affect the willingness and resilience of EU countries to contribute? I think that's a very good and very timely question. Svetlana?
Thank you. Well, there are contributions and contributions. I mean, it's not only the European Union member states are maybe not the largest PCCs and TCCs, but still they're contributing with other means financially, for example, also with very high technological enablers, which are critically necessary for the operations and missions. So the willingness is there and will stay, because the European Union is, as any country in the world, committed to the peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping. I'm not the spokesperson of the European Union, but as a member state, we work on both tracks, and will be committed, I guess, to contribute with the means which they have. That's why I mentioned these rotation scales, because I know there are a lot of rotation scales with between different member states of the UN member states. But what exactly the European Union member states are trying to establish rotation schemes for these high-end enablers, which will make technologically the missions and operations more effective. We are not yet there. It's a long process, but there is a nice idea by Ireland and the incoming member of the Security Council. Maybe that will make a push to come with results very soon, and we are supporting them in this effect. On women, peace and security question, well, as I said, every crisis gives an opportunity for new ideas and new efforts, and I think also from experience of European Union itself, it's that every crisis actually brings something new. So I guess this is also the chance for women's peace and security in these 20 years of the resolution 1325, sorry, that we will have the breakdown in the finally getting there with as far as the involvement of women in these operations can grow and can be more balanced than until now. But it's something which is very different in different countries, so difficult to give a general answer on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We only have 10 minutes left, so I guess the answer from your first from the first question is to contribute in a different way and in a more collective way. We have two more questions. One is, given the paralysis of the Security Council so far, can we anticipate a greater role for the General Assembly as has happened with the Syrian conflict? Is this a sign of innovation of the system? I already kind of know the answer. For me, it would be no. But who would want to answer this? Maybe Adam or Richard? Richard?
I think you will see other parts of the UN system trying to take on a greater role in peace and security if the Council does indeed become more paralyzed. We've already seen, for example, the Secretary General trying to invest in getting development actors and partners like the World Bank to focus more on security. I think we've actually seen quite a lot of positive energy around the High Commissioner for Human Rights in terms of engaging with some conflict situations. And obviously, Secretary General Guterres and other UN officials have focused a great deal on what they can do to support the African Union. And one of the reasons that the UN is so interested in supporting the African Union is that Guterres and others worry that it won't be possible to get stuff done in New York in future, so they'll have to try and respond to conflicts with political weight from Addis. As for the General Assembly itself, I can imagine situations in which the General Assembly would become more involved in specific crises. But I would say that I think the overarching theme in the GA in the next few years is going to be about the economic impact of COVID-19. And we're very likely to see big debates about who should pay for the recovery process and how to share the burden of the recovery process after this pandemic in the General Assembly. They're likely to create a lot of friction between poorer countries and donor countries. So I'm afraid that I see the GA focusing on that rather than peace and security. I've seen one question come in, will the influence of China in the financing of peacekeeping be changed as a result of COVID-19? It's hard to say because we don't know the economics, but yes, China's financial muscle in peacekeeping is likely to continue to increase. And that I think will also generate more frictions with the US and other powers.
Thank you, Richard. Now, two questions for Adam. First, given the increase of internal regional conflicts, are there emergency or contingency plans for peace and stability if funding increase is not plausible? And then we have a question from Jean Bayot, former Deputy Force Commander in MONUSCO, that wants you to share the views on how communication has to be handled at UN HQ and local levels on contributor readiness and the need for more transparency. And maybe after Adam, Jeremy, you can answer, you can follow up. Like 2 minutes each, max. Thanks.
Sure. I think the starting point for almost both of these questions is I think this has been a really important moment for this SG, who wasn't really in the foreground for much of his tenure and has really stepped into it in not only the global ceasefire, but in a lot of other ways. And if you just go on the UN's website and you see the number of communications that his office is putting out, not just communications, but he's got policy briefs that are very well articulated around issues like human population movements and socioeconomic issues. I don't know if they necessarily, I wouldn't call it necessarily contingency planning for this question. What I think they show is the SG really stepping into the space that's been made for him in this and making a claim for multilateralism to have an impact. What I haven't seen yet on those communications is anything particularly focused on peacekeeping per se in terms of the big picture, although I think it's implicit in a lot of the other statements that he's made. But I think in terms of contingency plans, I mean, as Richard said, we're in such an early phase, it's very hard to know in the peacekeeping context what a contingency plan would be. And I'm sure that Jeremy at a mission level has done a lot of contingency plans. I remember doing that around what happens if the budgetary committees don't give us what we need, or it's a 10% cut. I mean, I'm sure that's happening. I don't know at the broader macro level whether it is, but I'm sure others have thoughts on that as well.
Thank you, Adam. Jeremy?
Yeah, I just on that as a point, yeah, absolutely. We've sort of done a lot of contingency planning on sort of once we got into this. I mean, it's not something we had prepared for in advance. We prepared for what might happen if the volcano goes off in Goma, but probably no one saw this one coming. But you know, since then we've obviously done a lot of planning, and as you do on the budget side, what if? But on the issue of from Jean about communication, well, I think I'd just go back to what I said earlier, I think, in saying, you know, it's about how people see the UN and see our worth as to whether, you know, they see we have a value either locally where we are or globally, you know, as an organization. And then it's about what you do, but also how you communicate what you do and who you communicate with. So I think communication is always key. And really, I'm not sure I can say much more than that. Otherwise, you know, keep communicating, keep convincing people what we're doing, that we have a worth. If we, you know, we generally believe we should stay to do something more, well, then we have to convince people that we do, and convince, you know, the donors that give, but also the people on the ground that we're here for. And usually, they feel that the UN makes a contribution where they are to their peace and security. As long as we're winning their, you know, trust, then I think we're starting off on the, you know, on the battle of winning that argument. Back to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. We are drawing to a close. Last question for Richard. NATO agreed in April to enhance peacekeeping with the UN. Is it possible to coordinate a COVID-19 response with NATO? 1 minute.
I was simply going to say that I think I'm right in saying that NATO has been working with UN humanitarian agencies in terms of the logistic response to COVID already. And, you know, there is NATO-UN cooperation. I believe that this year NATO and the UN agreed on planning for ways that NATO could support the UN in Tripoli if the crisis in Libya got worse. But overall, I think there are some pretty big political obstacles to NATO-UN cooperation, especially given that there are at least 3 powers in the Security Council, China, Russia, and France, who are a little nervous about letting NATO get too powerful these days. Just before I sign off, I wanted to say that some of the work that I've been basing my comments on here was done with Louise Anderson of the Danish Institute of International Studies. You can find what we wrote together on their website. And I should have started by saying that, but I'm going to finish it by saying it instead.
Thank you, Richard. I think that one question remains after all this is whether this pandemic will shift the attention of the UN as a whole, the UN system, and the politics of the UN to more socioeconomic issues, and where and if that will shrink or not, the peace and security agenda. I want to leave you with this and to thank our great panelists. It was great to see you online, all of you, and to thank, of course, the University of Leiden and the chair of UN Studies in Peace and Justice. This will be, this is recorded and will be online soon. Thank you, bye-bye.